For a long time, the pinnacle of North American, or indeed even global Valorant, was defined by the achievements of Sentinels. Through the early days of competitive play, we experienced through this team the zenith of professional Valorant. However, in hindsight, it seems it may have also been the zenith of this team as well, as they've been unable to forge the same success that they found back then. Despite many fans believing in the potential for Sentinels Dominion to be revived, another North American team has taken hold of the top of the leaderboard and patiently proven that they will not be thwarted. OpTic Gaming have just qualified for Masters Copenhagen, which will be their 4th Masters event, 4th International LAN event, and all of this on top of 6 top 4 finishes in Challengers or Challengers Finals events. And not only is no other North American team so well decorated, but the EMEA teams who were finding massive success earlier on in OpTic's era are no longer the top regional performers. Think teams like MEC, Ascend, and G2. Sentinels have experienced a precipitous downturn over the course of the last year, since their famed lossless run at Masters Reykjavik 2021. But that begs the question, why is it that Sentinels managed to fall off, but OpTic haven't? First, I think it's very important to consider at what point in the Valorant lifecycle Sentinels found most of their success. It's entirely understandable that early success in any game, especially a game that is going to bring over non-endemic players, is going to be fleeting. The success is going to be found by those players who have inbuilt instincts and mechanical skill, because the true depths of the game aren't really understood at that point yet. For comparison, some of the best early teams in Overwatch were Misfits and Team Envy, but when these teams then transferred into the Overwatch League and became the Florida Mayhem and the Dallas Fuel, they were quickly outmatched by the next wave of players. Sentinels comprise 5 players, all of whom have been professionals in other games, including Overwatch, CSGO, and Apex Legends. This meant they kind of received a buff from the lens through which they looked at the game, but also having high-level experience in other games. Even Tens, who came in to step in for Sinatra, had professional experience playing CSGO. This in and of itself doesn't mean that a team is going to get bad, just because the players came from other games or because they found early success, but what it does mean is that those early advantages that helped you find that early success are not necessarily always going to be enough to keep you ahead of everybody else's learning curve. Back then, a very loose, reactive way of playing suited the depth of understanding very well, and this really became known as the playstyle that Sentinels mastered as their own. However, this also brings up the first big difference between OpTic and Sentinels: embracing new playstyles and new metas. One of OpTic's key strengths, and arguably Sentinel's key weaknesses, has been the embracing of new playstyles and new metas, and maintaining an aspect of ingenuity and flexibility while progressing. In Stage 3 of 2021, after Mummy had left the roster and Ye had taken his place, a lot of the defining playstyle of OpTic came from the way that Victor was played on Skye. Skye was a really big agent at the time, and the way that she could be played varied. You could either play her as this hyper-supportive initiator who used all of her utility to help her teammates, or you could play her really aggressively off of her own flashes. Victor was a player who was very good at leaning into either playstyle when he needed to, but ultimately he was great at being sacrificial and selfless to allow his teammates to benefit from his utility when they needed. With Ye being a recent addition to the team, his confident jet opping could be the perfect complement to the initiation provided, and overall they just thrived in this meta that was in front of them. Their compositional choices were extremely consistent, usually comprising a core of Sova, Killjoy, Astra, and Jet, with Victor basically picking Raze or Skye dependent on the map. This became more clear in the Masters Berlin playoffs, where they defeated Sentinels, who were still running outdated Phoenix compositions as well as no Sentinel on split, and then 100 Thieves, who ditched their KO Omen comps to try and pick up the meta last second. In 2022, the meta had evolved, and with it OpTic's playstyle. Ye was playing less Jet and more Chamber, an agent that gave him more flexibility in his in-game decisions. Whether he wanted to play passively, aggressively, committed, or just for opening peaks, OpTic embraced the full breadth of options available to them through this agent. This was supported by their KO play, an adoption on a playstyle that had been popularized by C9 during Champions, and one that OpTic did not want to be caught slacking on, especially after their own Champions performance had been quite lackluster. OpTic were not unique in their espousal of Chamber and KO, however, I do think that it's fair to say that OpTic did not cling to their love of Jet as much as other teams who were starting to pick Chamber did. In fact, where other teams were keen to still pick Jet at any opportunity, OpTic were one of the first teams to subsume Raze into their comps instead as their main duelist. This was particularly notable on Fracture, where a lot of teams were still playing Jett, but later came to be known as very much a Raze map. As the stage went on, OpTic became more imaginative and pioneering in their choices, and truly became the first team to really show how Neon could, and perhaps should, be played. At the time, she was a new agent whose kit had not really been considered worth giving up any other agent in a composition for, but OpTic had been extremely diligent in analysing not only how their own playstyle worked, but also hers, and being able to apply that in an effective way. The Haven game versus version 1 was an infamous one, but it really gave us an insight into how OpTic looked at things in the background. Using Neon for aggressive openers, whether to get an opening pick or for orb acquisition, was a way that really worked for them. And not only that, but they really let go of the idea that her kit had to be used to make hero plays like a Jett might. Instead, they understood that Victor using her may invoke an early death, but that holistically it would bring the value that they needed to the team's play. Even by the time OpTic got to Masters Reykjavik 2022, they were still using Neon regularly in their compositions, and thus she was a notable part of their success at that event. It's entirely possible for teams to struggle to keep ahead of the curve after being so defining in setting one themselves. But even going into stage 2, OpTic remained open-minded and malleable in their attitude to trying new things. They were one of the first teams to embrace trying Fade and Yoru, and this was actually a big part of their win over Stage 1 rivals Cloud9. However, it's also important that they remain proficient in their use of agents such as KO, Neon, and Astra, even as their pick rate declined amongst other teams. Compare all of this to Sentinels, who were still receiving criticism in Stage 1 2022 for their loose, outdated playstyle. The broad opinion was that they were doing what worked for them in early to mid 2021, but that it wouldn't have the advantage they were looking for against stronger teams with more proficient utility usage. It really seemed to be the advent of the Astra Viper meta that marked the beginning of the downfall for Sentinels, and that really correlated with this understanding that they preferred reactionary play over more stringent, slow site setups. It oftentimes meant their utility usage within a round was less economic than their opponents, and that meant that the exceptional mechanical skill on their team just wasn't seeing its full potential. For many, it became clear that Tens especially was not seeing the same personal results that he had done in the past, but a lot of that really came down to a failure to sufficiently set him up for his own plays compared to teams who are doing a much better job at setting up their Jetts. Too many times the team would lose out in opening duels due to Tens being left alone, and then they wouldn't have their attack dog available to them later on in the round for when the actual engagement starts. In essence, the feeling that Sentinel's playstyle gave during this controller-heavy meta was that they oftentimes felt underprepared for their engagements. Whereas other teams spent a lot of their round ensuring that they were prepared, it was like Sentinels were relying on instinct and intuition to carry them through. It was a playstyle that felt out of date and unsubstantial for the demands of the game in the present. But when we look into 2022, we still see some of those same issues. Granted, Sentinels did adopt and pick up Chamber, but really he was far too powerful not to be. That said, given their reluctance in the past to do similar things, it was still a good thing to see. When the nerfs to Astra and Viper came in, there was some hope that this was going to take Valorant back to a time that would really work with Sentinel's preferred playstyle, but the results still didn't seem to come in. In week 5 of stage 1, they got outclassed by version 1, who had a much stronger Chamber KO and supported their Jett a lot better than Sentinels did, and as soon as they got into the playoffs, they were bumped down by the up-and-coming machine-like behemoth that was the Guard. Stage 2 saw no wins in any of their group stage games, although 3 of their losses were 13-11 losses, and there were some signs of experimentation in there with picks onto Neon and Yoru in the fray. However, they still displayed a reluctance to choose Raze over Jett in some instances. Stage 2 did feel like it was close to being less disastrous than it was, but while Sentinels had clearly shown that they were warming up to this idea of trying new things, it almost felt like that long period of reluctance that they had previously had sort of left them steps behind the other teams. Overall, OpTic has consistently shown a dedication to being ahead of the meta, while Sentinels almost feels like they feel pressured to catch up. The next aspect that I wanted to discuss was coaching decisions. This has been a great point of contention amongst a lot of Valorant fans, that Sentinels, for most of their tenure, have decided to run coachless. The story goes that Shazam, as the IGL, did most of the VOD reviewing and planning, and he would take that information into his IGLing as he saw fit. After Masters Berlin, the team decided to seek out a coach, but it was reported that Shaz class preferably wanted an ex-player, someone who wouldn't be too overbearing or take too much control, but could see the game through the lens of a pro. As a result, it was announced that FaZe Clan's Raucus would be coming in as the first ever head coach for Sentinels just in time for Champions. This was a pretty exciting announcement, as it really felt like the game had gotten to a point where being without a coach simply wasn't a good option. Plus, it meant that a lot of the responsibility and overtime work could be taken off of Shazam's shoulders, and therefore give him more time to focus on his in-game role and not burn himself out. Sentinels still did have a rough time at Champions. They didn't make it out of groups and they only beat Furia, but it could be partially forgiven to the fact that this was basically the start of a new era for the team. However, Raucus was only with the organization on loan until January the 1st, 2022, and in February, after Sentinels' first loss of the new year, announced that he was no longer their coach. It was said that Sentinels had hoped to buy out Raucus permanently, but that no compromise could really be come to between the two organizations, and as a result, he announced that he was LFT as a player. In this time, many thought Sentinels should or would search for a new coach, perhaps someone who could take a more heavy-handed role in the control of the team. However, in all of this time, Sentinels said nothing about looking for a new coach. There were rumors that they weren't interested and rumors that they were. However, all of this was quashed in May when it was announced that Raucus would be rejoining the team. He was reported in Deserto as saying, "They don't need anyone to hardcore coach them," perpetuating the long-standing idea that Sentinels were not keen to have anyone who wanted to take a more stringent coaching role in their team. For OpTic, their most notable coaching change came right after Masters Berlin, where they fell to Gambit at the final hurdle. Mike's was removed for Chet, who still remains the head coach on the team today. That was, to some, seen as controversial due to Chet's weak track record on other teams, but what it definitely was decisive. Coaching and backroom staff decisions can be really hard to judge due to the fact that as outsiders, we don't get to see the true value or lack thereof of a coach. Oftentimes it requires a lot of good synergy with the players, which in and of itself requires the players to respect the methods and opinions of the coach. In September 2021, Shazam gave a really interesting answer at a press conference regarding whether Sentinels would be interested in looking for a coach. He said, "I don't think having a coach is a mistake at all. The right coach can definitely contribute a lot and help. I just think for the dynamic of our team, it's better for how we function, and I like doing the work, so when I'm in the server and I recognize stuff, it's fine. Eventually, I want to get a coach. It's just we're taking our time. We're trying not to force the issue and trying to find someone who can mesh in well, so it's not too many cooks in one kitchen." While this comes across as open-minded to the issue, it could also be interpreted as Shazam being reluctant to give up any control to an external force as they become a more influential decision-maker on the team. Admittedly, this was during Masters Berlin, which was the very beginning of their downfall, and maybe a bit too early for most people to see an issue with it. After all, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But it does also raise questions about the stubbornness of the team to fix the failures themselves, rather than bringing in someone else to help coach them out of it like every other team. In my opinion, I find it questionable that the perfect opportunity to add more structure to the team, especially at a time where it was developing past its former relative simplicity, was overlooked or waived. Whether this was due to something as nefarious as ego and stubbornness isn't necessarily for me to decide, but I do think it was a major contributing factor to Sentinels' rapid fall from grace, something which could not be attributed to OpTic. OpTic and Sentinels are both Hall of Fame level rosters who have defined the early years of Valorant. However, it's clear that only one of these two teams have been successful in maintaining that success. Through innovation and open-mindedness, it seems OpTic have found a method that has constantly enabled their raw skill to be used in a way that bests their opponents. Meanwhile, it feels like many of the skills which set Sentinels apart in the beginning have become wasted and unsupported as time has gone on, a problem which perhaps they themselves recognize now that they've got their coach, a roster change, and an openness to trying new things in the server. All in all, these two teams have found wild success, and only they have the power to do what it takes to continue to find that in the future. Who knows if either of them will be able to do it, but for now, these are my opinions as to why OpTic has, and Sentinels thus far have not. Personally, I'm just very excited to see the future of these two teams, and whatever happens with them, they will always be two team names that reverberate in the halls of Valorant history. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.